I'm here with Flick Gray, who's given the final keynote at the TheMHS Conference 2017. Got a standing ovation, wowed people in her own words. So, Flick, I maybe get you to sort of introduce yourself a little bit, like who you are and what is it that you do?
Oh, how long have we got? I mean, I think there's so many different stories we can tell about who we are, but I think in this space, I was very privileged to be the keynote speaker, and the hat that I had on was a consumer keynote. So I'm someone who has my own experiences within the mental health system on the service using side of that equation. But I think all of us bring so much more of ourselves to this space, and I come as an academic, I come as someone interested in alternatives, interested in the earth, interested in how we do decolonisation, all sorts of things. So, and thinking about who is the we that we're even talking about. So yeah, a whole lot of different things, and I love ideas and getting together and talking.
And what did you talk about this morning? You know, what were some of your overarching messages?
Oh, that is such an interesting question. I was so tired, I'm not sure I can say. But no, I mean, I think I brought a whole lot of things together. It's actually funny trying to think, what did I talk about? I guess, you know, some burning questions that I've got that I hoped would resonate with the audience. And a lot of it just came from things I'd been hearing over the conference that are sort of, how do we navigate the complexity of the mental health terrain together in a way that doesn't other anyone, that doesn't say they're our enemy. We're all trying to do this together. But there are also differences, and there are structural differences, so that some of us are put in certain positions and that has consequences. And how do we make space for the hard conversations so that when we try and navigate this stuff, we're really able to be more human together and talk about hard stuff. And I came with both academic ideas and very small child ideas, and I think they're all needed. So
Two things I'd like to touch on that you didn't talk about. One of them was violence.
Yeah.
Could you sort of explain?
Yeah, and so that actually came about. I gave a talk on Tuesday, and I was very, very vulnerable, and I spoke very powerfully and very emotionally. And someone came up to me, and I was very critical of a particular idea, and someone came up to me and was very angry with me, and I felt like they'd punched me. And I went away and thought about it and thought, yeah, but my talk, in some ways, that person would have experienced it as a punch towards them. And I thought, yeah, but then before that I experienced, and I was looking at the layers of violence, and that I think to say that we should just be nice to each other is so simplistic, and yet that often feels right. Like, we should find a way to be kinder. And I'm like, kinder, but also we need justice. We need to have space where some ways of being don't dominate other ways of being. And so how to find a language for that has really kind of been stirring in me for the last couple of days. And so I drew on the work of a theorist called Slavoj Žižek, who is a theorist who talks about violence. And so he really talks about structural and symbolic violence. And I think in the mental health system, we can focus sometimes on aggression management and things like that, when actually we're not looking at the structural and symbolic violence. And I think that's really important, that we try to do justice, not just be kind and compassionate. But how to do that is tricky. It's really tricky.
And the other thing you talked about was benevolent othering.
Yes, the PhD.
Yeah.
Don't mention the PhD. Yeah, so it's a concept I've been working with. I've been doing my PhD for a very long time, and it's definitely grown over that time. But it's taking the idea of othering, which a lot of theorists talk about in so many different domains. And I'm looking particularly at social identities that are othered. So, people who are same-sex attracted, Indigenous, Muslim, disabled. Not that these identities are inherently other, but that they get talked about in ways that there's a dominant culture, and there are ways in which certain ways of being are minoritised or treated as if they are allowed to exist, but not really valued, or not really kind of part of the human, the human diversity. There is power differences. And some people respond to that by being nice and kind of saying, well, I'll include those others, but they don't. They keep the structures of symbolic and structural violence in place. So they try not to be violent on the kind of between people level, but they don't look at the justice levels. And so my critique of benevolent othering is one way of understanding my own experiences in the mental health system, but also trying to find a way to be more human without reinscribing these ways of being. And I did speak about, in my talk on Tuesday, about being a coloniser in this country and these relationships of othering. I'm implicated on both sides too. We all are. We're all trying to figure out how to be with others who have less or more power than us in different ways, and how to talk about that complexity in a way that has integrity. So,
you touched on the marriage equality debate.
I did a little bit. I did, yes, because it's topical and also very, very painful. You know, I'm queer myself. A lot of people I know have kids. I'm considering having kids, and I don't want a world where certain people's lives are devalued. And I think that the way that the political debate has been set up is this idea of, there's just two sides and we should be even-handed. And I'm like, no, there's not. There's one side that's dominant and one group of people that have consistently been told our lives are not as worthwhile. And I think as someone who has multiple identities that are devalued and multiple identities that are privileged, it's like, how do we honour the value of all of these experiences? And the queer community, I think, has changed the world in ways that we don't really name. So, for example, around the HIV/AIDS epidemic, stuff around consent and safe sex has changed the world for all of us. Or around sexual pleasure, you know, there's all sorts of ways in which the queer community has opened up more space, or for families, what that means, and how we might have a biological family, but we might have a logical family of choice, you know, a different kind of family. And I feel like in the mental health terrain, sometimes we talk about this stuff as if it's health. And I'm like, it's not just health, it's every part of being human. It is political, it is spiritual, it's all of these things. So, yeah, in terms of the same-sex marriage debate, or marriage equality, which is a much better way of putting it, I do really worry about young people coming out, or young people who have queer parents, or, you know, and I don't just want to worry about the young people, but I do, because I think when you're not as connected into the communities of support, people can be really vulnerable, and queer kids kill themselves more often. And so this is a suicide mental health issue. It's not mental health, it's a social justice issue that enters the mental health terrain. And so we need to talk about all of these different ways in which our identities intersect. And yeah,
it's a heavy topic. And just finally, reflecting on the past few days, you know, like you were asked to give like a 5-minute sort of summary.
I was. Yeah.
What have you taken away from these 3 days?
I think what's really tricky is that there's so many layers of this conference, and for me personally, I actually feel like it was an initiation ceremony for me personally, which is a very different question than what have I experienced in the content. But for me, I feel like on Tuesday I was with my consumer peers, and I felt like we're talking about some difficult things, but by the end of the conference I actually realised I'm not an elder, but I'm an adult. You know, an elder is a later life stage. I'm not at that point, but I feel like I'm no longer a kind of allowed to be here, you know, you can come and be with the grown-ups. I realise I actually feel like I became one of the grown-ups who other people will look to for approval or mentoring. In fact, that's already started happening, and I honour that. I feel like, that was really painful to get up there on stage and go through a ritual of, here's what I think, what do you think? And I got a standing ovation, and that felt like, yep, you are in the tribe in a different way. And previous conferences, I do feel like I've come in a kind of, I'm grateful to be allowed to be here. And now I feel like I want to offer that to other people and kind of hold space and be able to step back. Part of it is about being able to step back, and it's like, yep, I've been in the limelight. Now it's time to kind of keep the space for other people, and that feels really beautiful.
It's interesting because lots of your work, I guess, is about power, and you talk about that, and lots of people have spoken about power in the past few days. You know, like, can you sort of explain the importance, or, you know, the place of power in this?
Well, the tricky thing is power is so diffuse, and so I'm much more aware of when I don't have power. We're all much more aware of when we don't, and we can point and be like, those people have power. But when we have it ourselves, how to use it in a way that is, like how to name that that's happening, how to navigate that, it's really uncomfortable for me in some ways. It's much easier for me to be an oppressed minority than to say, oh, actually, I'm in a position of power. And somebody called me out on the first day and said, how dare you, from this position of power, criticise someone who has less power? And that stuck in my body, and I thought, do I have power? Where do I have power? How do I know? And often we only know this in conversation with other people when we can explore it, because people with power usually don't realise they have it and just think they're going through life, and the people who don't have it are acutely aware of it. And so I've spent the week in a executive suite with access to all the fanciest part of the Hilton Hotel, and I go home and that is not my life back home. I go back to being, one of the people, and that's a really strange space, but also a real honour and a really fun thing to do for a while, to play in the Hilton. So really trying to create space where we can talk more about power and maybe do power differently. Yeah.
How does power inscribe itself in the mental health space?
How? God, in so many ways, constantly. I mean, in different space, it's configured differently. But, there's enormous violence in the mental health system that if you tell someone that you're suicidal, the state can lock you up. That is a really power-laden act. But the words we use, I'd say in some ways, a Foucauldian idea of power as being diffuse, and of being something that we take up ourselves, so to see myself as a consumer is a way of taking on, the gaze of someone in more power than me, and seeing myself in that way, and we start to discipline ourselves. Those kind of complexities of power we don't even come close to talking about, but even understanding what are my experiences, how do I see myself as a human being, it's completely inflected with all these different forms of power. And I think what I try to do is open up spaces where things that have less power can be kind of where there's some structural redress of power imbalances, so that we can actually talk in a way that is hopefully enriching the human condition. And small topics.
Yeah, just a little heavy. Thanks so much for your time.
No problem.